From a tiny village, Rome rose to conquer the ancient world. Its legions marched from Britannia to Africa, forging an empire. Engineering wonders connected its vast domains, but power bred conflict, and the empire began to crumble. Rome's legacy endures, a testament to human ambition.
Before Rome existed, before any emperor walked its marble halls or any legion marched beneath its eagle standards, there was only a river and a hill. The Tiber River moved through the flat plains of central Italy, with the quiet, unhurried pace of water that has no idea what will eventually be built beside it. On its eastern bank, a cluster of low hills rose above the marshy ground. 7 of them, modest by any geographical measure, offering nothing obviously remarkable to the eyes of travelers passing through. Small farming communities had settled on these hills for generations, growing grain in the fertile volcanic soil, herding sheep across the grasslands of Latium, and living in a way that their Etruscan neighbors to the north and Greek colonists to the south would have considered unremarkable in almost every respect. The Etruscans, in particular, dominated the region at this time, building sophisticated cities, practicing skilled metallurgy, and exercising political influence over the Latin peoples settling the land around the Tiber's bends and crossings. Nothing about this particular crossing point suggested destiny. No prophetic voice announced that on this muddy riverbank, beside these 7 ordinary hills, a civilization would eventually emerge that would conquer everything from Scotland to Mesopotamia, building roads, laws, and ideas so durable that the world still walks on them today. It looked like a forgotten village. It was about to become history's greatest empire. Every great civilization eventually invents an origin story worthy of its ambitions. Rome's was magnificent. According to the legend that Romans themselves cherished for centuries, the city was founded in 753 BC by twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, sons of a war god and a Vestal virgin, abandoned as infants and nursed by a she-wolf on the slopes of the Palatine Hill before being discovered and raised by a shepherd. When the brothers quarreled over where to build their city, Romulus killed Remus and named his new settlement after himself. It was a founding myth perfectly calibrated to explain Roman character. Born of divine blood, forged in violence, named after the man willing to pay the ultimate price for his vision. Modern historians know the reality was more gradual and more complicated. A cluster of Latin villages on the Palatine and Esquiline hills slowly merging during the 8th century BC into something increasingly unified. Their communities drawn together by shared geography, shared language, and the practical advantages of coordinating their defenses against more powerful neighbors. But the legend mattered enormously to the Romans themselves, because it told them who they were, people of divine origin, tested by hardship, willing to make hard choices, destined for greatness. They believed this story completely, and belief, as Rome was about to demonstrate across 6 centuries of relentless expansion, is one of history's most powerful forces. Rome was beginning to grow. The earliest Romans were ruled by kings, 7 of them, according to tradition, spanning the period from the city's founding to 509 BC. These early monarchs, a mixture of Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan origins reflecting the diverse communities that merged to create early Rome, shaped the city's most fundamental institutions, even though the republic that followed would officially despise the very concept of kingship. Servius Tullius, the 6th king according to tradition, organized Roman society into a census-based system, dividing citizens by wealth, a political structure that proved so durable, its basic logic survived into the Republican and imperial periods. Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, became the 7th and final
Citizens
king
of this great
whose
city,
arrogance and
we
tyranny
stand at a
so
crossroads.
offended Roman
Our ancestors
aristocratic
built these temples and
sensibilities
laws
that a
through
group of
unity.
senators organized
Let us
a coup
honor them
in
by preserving
509
our
BC
traditions and
that
strength.
expelled him and his family
Together, we will
permanently
forge a
from the city.
future worthy of their
Whether
legacy.
this founding story of the Republic is precisely historically accurate or contains legendary embellishment, the political meaning Romans attached to it was absolutely clear. Kingship was tyranny, and Roman citizens would never again tolerate one man claiming permanent hereditary power over their community. This fierce anti-monarchical conviction became so deeply embedded in Roman political culture that even Julius Caesar, who effectively held royal power, never dared claim the actual title of king. The monarchy had fallen, replaced by something genuinely new in the ancient world. The Roman Republic that emerged from the expulsion of the kings in 509 BC created a system of government whose innovations influenced political thinking for the next 2,500 years, including the architects of the American Constitution, who explicitly modeled their own republic on Roman precedent. Power that had belonged to one king was divided among two consuls elected annually, each holding authority for 1 year only, and each capable of vetoing the other's decisions, a structural check on concentration of power that reflected the senator's primary fear, that any single individual might accumulate enough authority to establish a new monarchy. The Senate, composed of former magistrates and Rome's most prominent families, provided continuity and accumulated wisdom that the annually changing consuls could not supply on their own. The assemblies of citizens held genuine power over legislation and elections, making Rome's republic more genuinely participatory than most ancient governments. Yet the republic's democracy was carefully calibrated to serve elite interests, with the wealthiest citizens' votes counting disproportionately more than those of the poor. A system that generated persistent tension between patrician families who dominated early Roman politics and the plebeian majority, who spent the first centuries of the Republic gradually winning greater political rights and protections through a long struggle historians call the conflict of the orders. The Republic worked well enough to survive, and surviving gave Rome the stability it needed to pursue something it had wanted from the beginning. Rome wanted more land. The conquest of Italy was not the result of a grand strategic plan drawn up by Roman generals surveying maps in marble offices. It grew organically, opportunistically, and with the relentless consistency of a civilization that approached military conflict with a combination of discipline, pragmatism, and absorption that its neighbors consistently underestimated until too late. Rome did not simply conquer peoples and subjugate them. It offered something remarkably sophisticated for the ancient world: various forms of alliance and citizenship that gave defeated opponents a genuine stake in Rome's continued success. Some communities received full Roman citizenship, others became Latin allies with partial rights and pathways to full citizenship. Others remained independent allies bound by treaty obligations, including providing soldiers for Roman armies. This system meant that every Roman military victory added not just territory but manpower, each conquered people eventually contributing soldiers who fought under Roman command in the next war, creating a compounding military strength that grew with each campaign. The Samnite Wars, fought in 3 exhausting rounds between 343 and 290 BC, established Roman dominance over central Italy after campaigns of genuine difficulty against mountain warriors who proved exceptionally tough opponents. The conquest of the Greek cities of southern Italy followed, completed by 272 BC when Tarentum submitted after its champion Pyrrhus of Epirus. The general who gave the language the phrase Pyrrhic victory concluded that defeating Rome was costing him more than victory was worth. The entire Italian peninsula was Roman. A greater enemy waited across the sea. Hannibal Barca is one of history's great military geniuses, and his war against Rome between 218 and 202 BC came closer to destroying the Republic than any other single threat in its 700-year history. The Carthaginian general devised a plan of extraordinary audacity. Rather than waiting for Rome to invade North Africa or challenge Carthaginian control of Spain and the western Mediterranean,
citizens of Athens,
he
hear
would
me!
march an army of
Our
roughly
city stands at a
50,000 soldiers
crossroads.
and
We must
37
unite
war
against the
elephants
threats
Spain
from without.
through the south of
Let
Gaul,
our resolve be as
cross the
unyielding
Alps
as these
in late
stones.
autumn, and
Together
strike
we will
directly
prevail.
into the Italian heartland. The Alps crossing was harrowing, with snow, freezing temperatures, treacherous mountain paths, and hostile local tribes inflicting losses that reduced his army substantially before it descended into the Po Valley. Yet what remained was an army led by a commander of unmatched tactical brilliance. At the Tiber River in 218 BC, at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, and most catastrophically at Cannae in 216 BC, where Hannibal encircled and destroyed a Roman army of approximately 80,000 men, killing perhaps 70,000 of them in a single afternoon. Hannibal demonstrated tactical innovation that military academies still study today. Roman allies began defecting. The city itself trembled. For 15 years, Hannibal's army remained in Italy, undefeated in the field. Yet Rome refused to negotiate, refused to break, refused to stop fighting. That stubbornness, more than any general, saved the Republic. And eventually Rome won. Rome's victory over Carthage in the Second Punic War in 21 BC transformed the Republic's position in the Mediterranean world so completely that nothing in its subsequent history can be understood without grasping how total that transformation was. Within the following 50 years, Roman power reached into the eastern Mediterranean with a speed that shocked the established kingdoms that had divided Alexander the Great's empire among themselves. Macedonia was defeated. The Seleucid Empire was pushed back from its western territories. Greece was absorbed. Carthage itself, after a third and final war, was destroyed in 146 BC. Leveled to the ground, its site reportedly salted to symbolize permanent desolation, its population enslaved or killed. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome controlled most of the Mediterranean world, and the wealth flowing into the city from conquered territories was staggering in its scale. Triumphant generals paraded through Rome's streets with captured treasures, enslaved prisoners, and exotic animals while crowds cheered their names. Senators grew fabulously wealthy from provincial administration and slave-worked estates. A new merchant class accumulated commercial fortunes from the trade networks that Roman military dominance had opened. Magnificent temples, basilicas, and public buildings rose across Rome's 7 hills, physical declarations of a city that knew it had become the world's most powerful. But success, as Rome would discover with growing alarm, creates problems that battlefield victories cannot solve. New challenges were gathering within the city's own walls. The century between the Gracchi brothers' reform attempts in the 130s BC and Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BC represents the most dramatic and consequential political collapse in Roman history. The period when the Republic, unable to adapt its institutions to govern an empire it had built, began tearing itself apart through political violence, civil war, and the rise of military commanders whose legions were more loyal to their generals than to the Senate that officially commanded them. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune in 133 BC, proposed land reforms to address the growing inequality that military success had created, was killed by senators who considered his proposals a threat to their wealth. His brother Gaius followed with broader reforms and was similarly killed. The lesson Roman politicians drew, that constitutional means were insufficient for major change, proved catastrophic. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Crassus, each in their own ways, demonstrated that military power backed by personal loyalty could trump the Senate's authority. Sulla actually marched his legions into Rome itself, an act previously considered unthinkable sacrilege against the city's sacred boundaries, to seize power by force in 88 BC. Each escalation made the next escalation more conceivable. Each precedent of political violence made further violence easier to justify. The Republic's institutions were being hollowed out from within by ambitious men who used Republican language while systematically destroying Republican practice. One general was about to make all previous examples seem modest by comparison. Julius Caesar combined military genius, political intelligence, personal charisma, and ruthless ambition in proportions that made him simultaneously one of Rome's greatest servants and its most dangerous citizen. His conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BC, documented in his own elegant prose account that remains readable today, added an enormous territory to Roman power, while providing Caesar with battle-hardened legions personally devoted to their commander and vast wealth from plunder and slaves that funded his political ambitions. When the Senate, alarmed by his growing power, ordered him to disband his army before returning to Rome, Caesar made the choice that defined the rest of his life and changed Roman history permanently. He crossed the Rubicon River in January 49 BC, the legal boundary across which Roman commanders were forbidden to bring armed forces, with one legion, committing himself to civil war. "The die is cast," he reportedly said. 3 years of civil war against Pompey and the senatorial faction ended with Caesar as the unchallenged master of the Roman world, holding the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. He reformed the calendar, packed the Senate with loyalists, and governed with an efficiency that left little room for the traditional exercises of republican power that senators valued. On the Ides of March 44 BC, 23 senators stabbed him in the theater of Pompey, each hoping to restore the republic they believed he had destroyed. The republic never recovered. All that remained was the question of who would replace him. Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son Octavian emerged from the brutal civil wars that followed the assassination as the last man standing, and the first Roman emperor, though he was careful never to use that word. His victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC ended 20 years of civil conflict that had exhausted the Roman world and its citizens. Octavian understood something Julius Caesar had not. Romans would accept the reality of one-man rule far more easily if the appearance of republican institutions was preserved alongside it. He took the honorific title Augustus, meaning the revered one, rather than king or dictator. He nominally restored the republic while retaining effective control of the army, the treasury, and ultimately all significant
Legionaries,
decisions.
the enemy falters before us.
Continued meeting,
Advance
the consuls
for Roman
continued
glory.
being elected, the
Hold the
assemblies
line.
continued
Push
functioning.
forward.
But everyone
Victory
who
is
mattered
ours.
understood
Charge.
that nothing significant happened without Augustus's approval, and he guided events with a political subtlety that made his power seem natural rather than imposed. His rule of 41 years, from 27 BC to 14 AD, gave Rome something it had desperately needed for a century: stability. The civil wars ended, the borders were secured, prosperity returned, the arts flourished under imperial patronage. Virgil wrote the Aeneid. Ovid wrote the Metamorphoses. Augustus rebuilt Rome from brick and left it, as he claimed, in marble. Rome was entering its golden age. The period historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, stretching from Augustus's reign through the reign of Marcus Aurelius, roughly 27 BC to 180 AD, represents one of the most extraordinary epochs in human history. A period during which perhaps 70 million people living under Roman rule experienced relative peace, prosperity, and the benefits of the most sophisticated administrative system the ancient world had yet produced. Roman roads, 50,000 miles of them across the empire, at the system's greatest extent, built straight, paved with stone, drained by carefully engineered slopes, and maintained by a standing corps of engineers. Compressed geographic distance in ways that transformed trade, military movement, and communication throughout a territory stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. Aqueducts carried fresh water into Roman cities at volumes that supplied public baths, fountains, and private homes with a reliability that most of Europe would not again achieve until the 19th century. Roman cities throughout the empire shared a recognizable architectural vocabulary of forums, basilicas, temples, theaters, and amphitheaters that gave provincial populations a sense of connection to the broader Roman world. Trade goods moved across the empire and beyond it. Silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, garum fish sauce from Spain, through commercial networks of extraordinary reach and sophistication. This was Rome operating at its most confident, most organized, most genuinely magnificent. But the borders were still expanding. The invasion of Britain under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD represented a decision simultaneously strategic and theatrical. Claudius, regarded as something of a joke by Rome's aristocracy, dismissed as a doddering fool whose physical disabilities marked him as unfit for power, desperately needed military glory to secure his political position after the Praetorian Guard had placed him on the throne following Caligula's assassination. Britain provided the opportunity. Known, mysterious, considered beyond the edge of the civilized world, its conquest guaranteed prestige, regardless of what the island actually contained. 4 legions crossed the Channel and rapidly defeated the British tribes in southern England, allowing Claudius himself to cross briefly and accept the surrender of the British kings in a carefully staged ceremony designed to maximize his personal glory. The subsequent conquest of Britain proceeded unevenly over the following decades, with the famous revolt of Queen Boudica in 60 or 61 AD, which destroyed the Roman towns of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium before being crushed, demonstrating the ongoing costs of maintaining control over resistant populations at the empire's distant edges. Hadrian's Wall, built from 122 AD across the narrowest width of northern Britain, marked the practical limit of Roman northward expansion and demonstrated something the empire was beginning to learn everywhere: that territory could be conquered that could not practically be governed. The question that had always lurked beneath Rome's expansion was finally forcing itself into view. Could the empire keep growing forever? Inside the city of Rome itself, at the height of the Pax Romana, approximately 1 million people lived in conditions that ranged from extraordinary luxury to desperate poverty within walking distance of each other. The Colosseum, dedicated in 80 AD under Emperor Titus, could seat 50,000 spectators watching gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, and public executions on a scale of theatrical brutality that served simultaneously as entertainment, social control, and demonstration of imperial power. The Circus Maximus held even more, perhaps 250,000 people watching chariot races that generated the same passionate partisan loyalties as modern sports teams. The Forum Romanum, surrounded by temples, basilicas, and triumphal arches commemorating Roman military victories, served as the city's civic and commercial heart. Roman bathhouses, the thermae, were not simply places for washing but social institutions where citizens of various classes mixed, conducting business, socializing, and debating politics in complexes that included libraries, gardens, and exercise facilities alongside the hot and cold bathing rooms. Roman cuisine, if you were wealthy enough to afford its more elaborate expressions, incorporated ingredients from across the empire: honey from Attica, olive oil from Spain, fish sauce from the Dalmatian coast, exotic spices from India. If you were among the urban poor, you ate bread distributed by the grain dole and hoped the apartment building you rented in the city's crowded insulae didn't catch fire or collapse before morning. The empire was changing in ways that the prosperity concealed. Rome's greatest emperors demonstrated that the empire, when well led, could achieve stability, prosperity, and genuine good governance over its vast and diverse territories with a consistency that belied the system's structural vulnerabilities. The five good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, ruling consecutively between 96 and 180 AD, represented the longest period of competent, consecutive imperial leadership in Roman history. Trajan, who died in 117 AD, extended the empire to its greatest territorial extent through successful campaigns in Dacia and Mesopotamia, his victories commemorated on the spiral columns still standing in Rome, whose carved reliefs document his campaigns with extraordinary historical detail. Hadrian traveled the empire personally, inspecting frontier defenses, standardizing administrative practices, and demonstrating by his physical presence that Rome's distant provinces were genuine parts of one coherent political system, rather than simply conquered territories. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations, private reflections written in Greek and never intended for publication, remain one of antiquity's most compelling personal documents, spent much of his reign campaigning on the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes whose pressure on the empire's northern borders was growing with a persistence that suggested something more threatening than ordinary raiding. Marcus Aurelius understood, with the philosophical clarity his Stoic training provided, that everything was temporary. He was right about that, and he was right to worry about what came after him. Not every emperor would be wise. The 3rd century AD subjected the Roman Empire to a crisis so severe that historians sometimes wonder how it survived at all. Between 235 and 284 AD, barely 50 years, the empire suffered approximately 50 different claimants to the throne, most of them military commanders elevated by their troops, who were then assassinated by other military commanders seeking their own elevation. 26 are recognized as legitimate emperors during this period, which works out to roughly 2 per year, giving some measure of the chaos involved. This political instability interacted catastrophically with the economic pressures already building within the empire. Currency debasement as emperors reduced the silver content of coins to fund military expenses, resulting in inflation that eroded savings and disrupted trade. The plague of Cyprian, a devastating pandemic that killed millions and reduced the population of key agricultural regions, simultaneous barbarian invasions along multiple frontiers as Germanic tribes from the north and a reinvigorated Persian Empire from the east sensed and exploited Roman weakness. Regions of the empire briefly broke away into independent successor states, the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, demonstrating that the political unity Augustus had established was not guaranteed under sufficient pressure. The infrastructure survived better than the politics, which was fortunate, because recovery was still possible if leadership could be restored. The empire needed someone capable of genuine reconstruction. The question was whether anyone strong enough to stabilize it could do so without making the underlying problems worse. Diocletian, who seized power in 284 AD, stabilized the empire through administrative reforms of lasting significance, dividing it for practical governance into eastern and western halves, each with its own Augustus and Caesar in a system called the Tetrarchy, the rule of four. Designed to ensure efficient administration across territories too large for a single ruler to govern effectively. Constantine, who emerged from the civil wars following Diocletian's retirement as the empire's sole ruler by 324 AD, made two decisions of world historical significance. First, he moved the empire's capital eastward, founding Constantinople on the Bosphorus in 330 AD, on a site of extraordinary strategic and commercial advantage. The crossing point between Europe and Asia, the entrance to the Black Sea, a defensible peninsula accessible by sea for supply but difficult to assault by land. Second, he embraced Christianity, ending the Roman state's centuries of intermittent persecution of Christians, and eventually issuing edicts of toleration that transformed Christianity's position from a minority religion facing occasional violent suppression into the empire's favored faith, and eventually its official religion. Whether Constantine's conversion was genuine spiritual transformation or shrewd political calculation, or both, its consequences were immense. Christianity would spread throughout Europe under Roman imperial sponsorship, its institutional church inheriting many of Rome's administrative structures when the political empire eventually collapsed. East and West were already beginning to drift apart in ways that no emperor's decisions could permanently counteract. The Western Roman Empire's decline during the 5th century was not a single catastrophic event, but a prolonged unraveling of authority across decades, as central government's ability to pay, equip, and command loyal armies deteriorated, while Germanic peoples settled increasingly within the empire's boundaries in arrangements that gave Rome the soldiers it needed, while gradually replacing Roman administration with barbarian governance. The Visigoths' sack of Rome in 410 AD shocked the Roman world psychologically. The city had not been taken by a foreign enemy in 800 years, even though the practical damage was limited compared to what followed. Attila's Hunnic Empire, devastating Roman territories in both east and west through the 440s, before Attila's sudden death in 453, accelerated the Western Empire's disintegration. One by one, the western provinces became barbarian kingdoms, the Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul, the Vandals in North Africa, the Burgundians in the Rhone Valley, the Franks increasingly dominant in northern Gaul. In 476 AD, the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, the teenager Romulus Augustulus, and declined to replace him, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople with the message that one emperor was sufficient for the whole empire. This moment, conventionally treated as Rome's fall, was in practical terms merely the official acknowledgement of something that had been happening gradually for decades. The East, however, was very much alive. Was this truly the end? The Eastern Roman Empire that continued from Constantinople survived the Western Empire's collapse by nearly 1,000 years, maintaining Roman legal traditions, the Greek language, Christian faith, and imperial political structures in a state that historians call Byzantine, but whose citizens called themselves Romans throughout its entire existence. Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, attempted the most ambitious project of the post-Western period, the reconquest of the lost Western territories. His general Belisarius recaptured North Africa from the Vandals and Italy from the Ostrogoths in campaigns of remarkable achievement, while Justinian simultaneously oversaw the codification of Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a systematic compilation that became the foundation of legal systems throughout Europe and whose influence remains directly traceable in the legal codes of dozens of modern nations. The Hagia Sophia, built under Justinian in Constantinople between 532 and 537 AD, remains one of the most extraordinary buildings in human history. Its massive dome floating above the interior on an innovation of structural engineering whose methods ancient builders understood practically even when they could not explain them theoretically. The Byzantine Empire's thousand-year continuity preserved classical learning, transmitted ancient texts to the medieval world, influenced the development of Orthodox Christianity throughout Eastern Europe, and maintained a sophisticated commercial and diplomatic civilization that kept Roman traditions alive long after Rome itself had become the seat of the medieval papacy rather than an imperial capital. Its influence spread across centuries further than anyone in 476 AD could have imagined. Looking across the full span of Roman history, from the modest village on the Tiber's banks to the Eastern Empire's final fall in 1453 AD, what emerges most clearly is the sheer range and depth of Rome's contributions to subsequent human civilization. Roman law, systematized most thoroughly in Justinian's compilation, but developing across 5 centuries of juristic innovation, established principles of legal reasoning, rights, and procedure that became foundational to the legal systems of virtually every European nation and their colonial descendants worldwide. The concept that law should be written, publicly accessible, and apply equally to all citizens, however imperfectly realized in Roman practice, became a standard that later legal systems measured themselves against. Latin, the language of Roman administration and eventually of the Catholic Church throughout the medieval period, became the ancestor of French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, and their dozens of descendant languages spoken today by approximately 1 billion people. While its influence on English vocabulary means that anyone educated in English draws constantly on Latin roots without recognizing it. Roman engineering, the concrete, the arch, the dome, the road, the aqueduct, provided a technical vocabulary that medieval builders inherited, Renaissance architects consciously revived, and modern engineers still study. The Roman Catholic Church, which preserved Latin learning throughout the medieval period and
The Roman
organized
Empire's vast
European
network of trade and
religious
naval routes connected
intellectual
its
life
provinces
for a
across land and
millennium
sea,
after
which
Rome's
edged naval
political
vessels, zeroed
collapse,
goods and legions
carried
from
Roman
Britannia to
institutional
Aegyptus.
forms,
These routes were the
legal
arteries of the
thinking,
empire,
and
vital
administrative
for commerce and
practices
power.
into the
This
modern
map
world
animates their
in
journeys,
ways that shaped
revealing the
European
empire's
history
interconnected
as
world.
profoundly as any military campaign. Rome's final legacy was still being calculated. Empires rise, empires fall. This is the basic rhythm of human political history, and Rome is no exception to it. Its armies disbanded, its emperors gone, its legions transformed from feared military formations into footnotes in history books studied by students who have never seen a Roman soldier except in film. Yet something about Rome refuses the label of simply ended. Stand in the middle of any major European city and look carefully at what surrounds you. The road network beneath your feet follows alignments that Roman surveyors established 2,000 years ago. The legal concepts that govern your contract, your property rights, and your citizenship trace their ancestry through an unbroken chain of juristic development back to Roman legal principles. The Catholic Church, whose institutional presence remains one of the world's most powerful organizations, inherited its administrative structure, its hierarchical organization, and its use of Latin from the empire, whose territorial ambitions it outlasted by nearly 2 millennia. The architectural language of government buildings, from the United States Capitol to the British Parliament at Westminster, speaks deliberately in a Roman vocabulary of columns, pediments, and domes, chosen because they communicate civic authority and republican aspiration in a grammar that Western civilization learned from Rome. The calendar you use to organize your year was reformed by Julius Caesar. The month of July is named for Julius himself, August for Augustus. Every day, without noticing, millions of people still walk on ideas first built by Rome. Its armies are gone, its emperors are dust, yet the Roman Empire never truly vanished.